Coming up on this episode of the DevelopSec podcast, we talk with Perry Krug about securing our databases. Tackling the challenge to integrate security into the development process? Looking for insights, answers, and practical solutions to avoid getting overwhelmed? Welcome to the DevelopSec podcast, where our focus is your success in securing and improving development processes. And here is your host, James Jardine.
Hey everyone, welcome to the DevelopSec podcast. I have a special guest today talking about database security and protecting your databases. I've got Perry Krug from Couchbase. So welcome, Perry, to the show.
Thanks, James. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Perry, give us just a kind of brief background. What do you do? Where do you work? What are you guys doing with databases? That type of stuff.
Sure. So I work for Couchbase. We make a NoSQL database. I'm sure many of your listeners have heard of. It's kind of a new class of databases specifically designed for interactive web, mobile, IoT, kind of big data applications. I've been with Couchbase for a little over 7 years now. Started when we were quite small. I'm now based out of our London office, but I was originally in our California headquarters. And my role is right now as a principal architect, focusing on our strategic accounts. So I work with kind of our top 5, top 10 accounts in the European and Asian region, kind of everything from education to architecture, implementation. I've got a lot of kind of deep experience with the product and how our customers are using it.
Perfect. Well, it sounds like you definitely have some experience with databases, that's for sure.
Just a bit.
Yeah, which is perfect because, to have the topic of protecting our databases, right? So we've got this idea of 5 must-have steps developers or really anybody working on the database should be taking to maintain a secure database. And it's interesting to me, that in so many places that I've worked, developers don't maintain a lot of the databases. You have DBAs to do a lot of that stuff. There's ops that actually deals with the actual operating system side of things with the databases that they reside on. So there's actually a lot of people that kind of this covers, which is great because, my audience is a lot of those people. Right? It's not just developers, but QA, it's business analysts, it's the whole gamut, system administrators, whoever's dealing with from a security standpoint. So these 5 must-have steps will, really reach and touch everybody that's out there listening right now, which is really great. So give me an idea, like the first step you have is never expose database to the internet. If you want to talk a little bit about what do you mean by that, what we should be doing.
Yeah, and I think kind of to your point earlier, even in or especially now in today's world with the introduction of kind of the DevOps role, with the introduction of more and more data to applications, to your point, we have even more people coming into contact with databases, even more people maintaining them, even more people asking to have access to the data. 10, 15 years ago, the database was this big piece of hardware that sat in a corner in a data center, and only a core group of people were even knew that it was there. And now with Couchbase, with NoSQL, with the introduction of the cloud, Amazon and Google and Microsoft, we're seeing the database become much more prevalent in the workings of developers and operations and even business analysts and all that. And people are across all those roles, able to get their hands on a database. It's all, a lot of this open source technology makes it much more accessible, much more easy to get started quickly, set up your own. And so along with that, I think there's been a kind of a gap in best practices and education about what does it mean to put data somewhere? What does it mean to make sure that data is secure? What does it mean to provide access to that? And so, yeah, this first point really kind of touches on one of the major pitfalls, one of the major lapses in awareness when you install a database, when you set up a database in the cloud, and you just let anybody around the world have access to that. You're really opening yourself up to the potential for that data and your system to become compromised. Unfortunately, it's very easy to do with some technologies. A lot of the earlier versions of some of these databases didn't provide the kind of controls out of the box to prevent that. And what we saw, over the last 2 or even 3 years now, with the ransomware attacks hitting Mongo and Elasticsearch, even some of the Hadoop installations, a lot of that comes down to both the users of those databases not really knowing what it means to secure them, and also the products themselves not really providing the controls out of the box to prevent people shooting themselves in the foot.
Yeah, it's interesting to think that, data, 10, 20 years ago was somewhat different than it is now. Yeah, we had databases, we built our applications, but the way we value data now seems to have vastly changed, where it's much more important. We want to keep everything because we can do something with that data at some point. And, so now it's becoming more critical. The database is becoming more important, not just as a repository for collecting our data, but it's got everything. It's just a wealth of knowledge. And, when I was doing production level development, and that was 10 years ago, we were pretty much set up. You had your firewall, your web application, another firewall, your SQL database. Everything was packed so tightly internally. And now we're seeing, especially with cloud and as you were mentioning, so many things going to a lot of these NoSQL type databases. We've got cloud where you can quickly stand up a database, and we don't think about the fact that, I just pushed a button, I have a new database. It's exposed. How is it that I got to that? That black magic of,
yeah.
I pushed a button, I have a database, and I can get to it. This is cool. And, I think a lot of that falls into that idea of security by obscurity, where, you think, well, I know the address to this thing. Nobody's going to find this. And yet it's really not true. Right? We can find these things out there. And that's the concern, is that we can't just rely on the fact that, I only know the address to this, so nobody else will be able to find that anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just go back a moment, too, because you brought up a really good point that the data that we're storing in these databases now is more valuable or equally as valuable as it has ever been. But the nature of that data has changed too, kind of dramatically, because 10, 20 years ago, you weren't recording the comings and goings of every person on Earth, or everybody in your user network. You were storing maybe your lists of products, your orders that people were placing with you. But now, we're recording our children's playthings, are transmitting data about our children, about what they're doing, up into the databases that everybody is storing. And so the data itself has become, I think, much more worthy of security. It's no longer just proprietary information that a company wants to keep safe for themselves, but it's literally information about people and their livelihood, and their lives. And so I think it's even more important now that we have all these great services that are bringing wonderful capabilities to us. It's even more important to recognize the data that those services are generating, and how much more important it is to keep that secure.
Yeah, it's a good follow-up to that, because as I look at it, the data has changed so much. I remember when we stored data, it was data we needed to run the app. Now people store data, it's anything I can grab, I'm grabbing it. And
Yep.
and that's whether it's transaction level, anything in the world, I'm going to take it, and if I can do something with it, I can do something with it. And we had our problems back 10 years ago, the fact that we were storing data, just everything in clear text. And now we're starting to see more encryption of some of the sensitive data we see, like your credit card numbers and that stuff. But now we just see that we have so much more data. And I think what a lot of people overlook is, and I talk about this a lot, like you think about data classification and what is sensitive data. people think typically PCI, but they're not HIPAA, but they're not thinking things like that tracking data, or the fact that somebody came in and bought certain items. They may not see that as sensitive type data, but in reality, pretty much everything we're collecting, it's sensitive to someone, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
we have to consider that as we're storing that data and not exposing it. So I have one more question on as far as exposing the database, and I don't know, do we see the database is exposed to the internet? Is that more prevalent when you're dealing with cloud services? Because, like I said, I mean, in the old days, we used to, if we had the database internally, I mean, it was like 3-4 layers deep. Mm-hmm. But you go cloud, right? It's easy. Everything's kind of flat. And so do we see it more as an issue when people are dealing on the cloud than internal? Like, hey, I'm going to host a database myself, like on my own network. Are we seeing those exposed as much?
I think you're right that it is much more prevalent from a cloud perspective. And because of the controls that organizations have in place, it's much harder to expose an internal database to the full public internet. But if I may, I think that's going to lead us nicely into the next point, because just because you're behind your company's firewall doesn't mean that your information and your data is inherently and perfectly secure. There is still the potential for either malicious or careless individuals within your organization. And so taking those extra steps to make sure that you are putting the right controls and encryption or whatnot around the data, whether it's cloud or not, is I'd say equally as important to be aware of where your gaps are.
Yeah, and so that next must-have step, right, is keeping your firewalls strong. It's interesting to me when we think about firewalls, because we often think about them as, I've got a network-based firewall, and that, just allows port 80 in or port 443 in. And then I've got, like a web application firewall, which is trying to inspect all the traffic and block out malicious stuff. And we also do have things, where they tout them as database firewalls. So is there a big difference between like a database firewall and a web app firewall and the network firewall? How do those fit together?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there isn't really a big difference in the technology itself. It's just a matter of how it's applied. And so you're right. At the very highest level of an organization, you want to have your company's firewall, and maybe you're only letting in web traffic, and then maybe you have kind of different zones or different areas within your network for different applications accessing different services. When we come down to the database level, we start to look at putting a specific firewall or specific kind of network restrictions around the database itself. The other kind of interesting change that has happened is now all of these new databases, Couchbase included, are distributed. And so they're not just running on a single piece of kit in the corner of a data center anymore. They're on 3, 5, 10, 20, 100 thousands of individual servers. And so it's not just enough to put control at one point of the single system anymore. You have to allow those servers to communicate with each other, but then you want to protect any external access from breaching that or from getting into that. And so we have customers who deploy another layer specifically around the database, controlling what systems or what individuals have access to that network. And it provides just that extra level of security. In some cases, it's actually a requirement for certain kind of PCI certifications to be able to control and say who has access to the network that your data is flowing on. And if you allow that to be everybody in your organization, well, it's not very secure. If you can shrink that down, you have much more control to say, we know who and what we are blocking in what area.
Right. So, basically kind of creating your own VLAN of databases, if you will. Sitting out there, making sure that, hey, only these applications have access in, or only these certain machines, right? If, admins need to be able to gain access or something like that. Now, can you get database firewalls that are kind of like a web app firewall where, if it identifies, like SQL injection attacks, can a database firewall pick that stuff up, or are they really just the same as a regular firewall and saying, look, I'm blocking ports, I'm giving network access level type control to our systems?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I think we're just talking about the latter there, the network level control. There are some interesting technologies out there that will kind of embed themselves in between your application and the database and monitor the calls going back and forth. I think that's more from a monitoring and kind of performance perspective rather than a protection perspective, because they're not intended to block any access. They're just intended to record or monitor what's going on.
Right. So definitely, the big point or key takeaway here is we want to make sure that we're limiting down what has access into those systems.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Which, it's always a good idea. And, this is why I say this is such a great topic to cover a lot of different roles within an organization, because, most devs aren't going to be working with firewall rules or anything like that. Maybe when you get into the DevOps side, maybe they're starting to handle some of that stuff. But, it broadens out. It has a big range of individuals that actually work together to help put something like this up. And, it's something to highlight to people. You see where breaches occur and, people jump right on devs. Oh, it's the developers, they didn't do this, or the developers didn't do that, they left a vulnerability. And we forget about all those layers and pieces that go together to have an application actually work. It's not just grabbing a piece of code, grabbing a database and saying, hey, I have an app, especially internally hosted, right? I mean, there's a lot of steps that go into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it, as much as developers have control to do some of these things or not do some of these things, I think it's as equally up to the database vendors to make their product capable of taking on these controls, make it defaults that are reasonable and safe, and also to provide the education to the developers, to the operations, to the business people that you need to be aware of what data is going in and how that data is being secured. It's education at all different levels, combined with the product capabilities to support that.
Yeah, and so we talk about, what are the vendors providing, and so the next step, right, take a secure by default approach. Talk a little bit about taking that default approach.
Yeah, so this I think points a little bit more to the products themselves, the technologies themselves, but not exclusively. But really, the idea that it should be hard to introduce a security vulnerability or security hole. Certainly, there are some things that are beyond our control at a product level, but there should be an exception or a setting to undo a kind of security capability, and whether that's enforcing a password on every installation requirement, like every installation like Couchbase does, whether that's enforcing encryption over the wire or on disk, whether that is just highlighting or calling out when certain security settings have been undone. All of those sort of things allow you help the developer, help the operator, help everybody not make those mistakes in the first place. If you say just install this product and out of the box it is secure, that's the best kind of ideal gold standard. And then you have to do something to undo that. Whereas kind of the other approach that over the years, companies like MongoDB had taken originally was, let's make it super easy to get access to. Let's make it super easy to work with, and we'll rely on somebody turning on security afterwards. Well, what happened? A whole bunch of people didn't turn on security afterwards, and so to their credit, Mongo has updated their software to kind of switch that back to the other side. Couchbase has always been that way to enforce security out of the box and force someone to undo it, kind of like the opt-in versus opt-out. If you make people opt out of security, it's much more prevalent in their mind than asking them to eventually opt in.
Yeah, it reminds me of the days, and we still get this, especially in the past when I've done like network tests. You run across SQL servers with SA and blank passwords. Some of that stuff that you could just recall over the years that you're like, oh, we got to get over this. And, we're starting to see that change, right? Now you can't have an SA blank password. They're going to force you to set a password. They're going to start enforcing password complexities, right? They're starting to build all this stuff up. And it seems like we are making quite a swing towards the secure by default approach, where, like you said, MongoDB has made drastic changes to start doing that. Where it's more secure by default, and you got to go in and flip switches. And, that makes it difficult, because I get it. We want easy use, especially when you're looking at something that's kind of a newer idea for people to get into, right? We want early adoption. So, if you make it hard and it's like, all right, well, here, you load this, but then you got to go and do this. You got to make this happen. You got to turn this on. You got to do that. People get overwhelmed. They don't adopt it, and so it's an interesting take of, all right, was it a conscious decision because of that, to do here, let's kind of make it easy, and then we'll figure out how to do the secure afterwards. But I think we're starting to see more databases and more software in general where it's becoming out more secure by default. And we're starting, I think, to see a lot more frameworks and databases where they're coming out with better documentation on securing those items. Are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, a lot of it has to do with the natural maturity of newer technologies. Security is almost never the first thought in your mind unless you're building a security product. But it is something, obviously, that needs to be at the top of people's minds nowadays. And both new technologies and the existing ones are making great strides in the whole secure by default approach, providing better documentation, better guidance, kind of cross-linking to the rest of the ecosystem. So it's one thing for the database to say, put a password on us, but it's another thing to say, put a password on us and make sure your technologies that are connecting to it, and make sure your firewall, and make sure your disk, and all these other things. So for everybody to have an awareness of the full stack nature of security. And while I may not be able to control your firewall, at least I can tell you to be mindful of that. And that helps you be more aware, helps raise the awareness of everybody that security is something we all have to take seriously.
Yeah, and I think we see that, even outside of database realm, like, you go buy a new computer now, right? Like new Macs, you buy a new Surface Book, they come with like drive encryption enabled by default. Seeing all there's a lot of things that we're seeing happen to help push us to that default approach. And as I was mentioning, we've got so many now they're getting better documentation of, hey, here's how to do this, here's how to secure your instance. I think we could probably still do better on why are we secure, like what really happens if you turn this off, because we could sit there and say, oh, here, turn this off, that'll expose your DB. But I think a lot of people don't give a lot of, thought about that. They're like, okay, I'll expose it. I just want this available. I want it to work. I needed to get it done, right? I got tight deadlines. Let me get through this, and they'll push to do that. And so, but I think we are getting a lot better at that, and I think we need to just encourage people to look at those defaults more and question when you're going to change those defaults. Why are you changing those defaults? Are you documenting those changes? Similar to, you look at when we manage firewalls, right? Hey, we have a change process. Why are you changing this value? How long is that change going to last for? What's the approval process? All that stuff needs to be done there as well. We shouldn't just be saying, oh, okay, yeah, I just go in and change. I don't know what the configuration is. We have to have a little bit more consistency around how those work. So, the next point, right? Securing the data in transit. I think this one's interesting. Because a lot of times we look at databases and we say, well, they're internal. So, my web browser my web server to my database, it's internal. Do I need to secure that? So, do we need to secure that internally?
Yeah, so I guess this is kind of in the same vein as the kind of first 2 points that we were making, was never exposing the data to the internet and making sure your internal firewalls are strong. For the same reasons, you want to ensure that you have the data encrypted as it travels back and forth between actors in the system. Internally, certainly that's your web farm, your application servers. You want to encrypt that because there's always, unfortunately, always the potential for a malicious actor inside of your network, whether they're part of your company or whether it's a hacker who has breached your various layers of security or gotten in through some other way. You want to be sure that you've done everything you can do to protect that data when it is flowing into or out of the database. So that's one thing internally is securing it. But then also we are increasingly using our databases to replicate data geographically or replicate data outside of our network. And so depending on your networking and VPN setup, you might be transferring data over the public internet, and so ensuring that it's encrypted and secure at that layer is important as well. Couchbase has the capability to synchronize data directly down to a mobile device, to an iPhone or an Android phone. Using our own replication that's not going through an application server. And we have encryption on that because that's also flowing over the public internet. So it's again going back to be the awareness of what is my data, where is it flowing, and how is it protected at all steps through that journey.
Yeah, and looking at the type of threat actors that exist in those different scenarios obviously makes a difference on when you're analyzing the risk of that. I mean, obviously going across the public internet, you never want to transmit it in clear text, but you might get a situation where somebody looks at it internally and they're like, well, we've got heavy network access control. These are very segmented between web server and database. Are we going to add this? I get a lot of people that push back, and it's usually not development side, it's usually network side, that push back on encrypting the data internally because they say it's too difficult to, monitor the traffic going back and forth, right? Their IDS systems can't see the traffic and they can't make decisions in that. And it's interesting to me to see those, and yet I think we're seeing a lot more people actually do more encryption internally, but again, some of that, especially when it comes internally, is going to come down to, okay, what's our risk? What's our threat actor here? What's the risk level that's going to actually attack this? But at the same time, how difficult is it to add this in? Like, what's your reasoning for not adding encryption to the data in transit between web server and SQL database, or replication across two servers within the same network even, right?
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point. I mean, it is an important part of security, but it's number 4 on our list. It's not number 1. And there are some performance implications depending on what kind of workload you have. And you're right, there is some added complexity. I think we certainly at Couchbase try to make it as easy to do as possible. And then I think it's also about coming back to the awareness of what is the data that you're storing in there. I think for HIPAA compliance, you have to have personal identifiable PII data encrypted in your internal network. But if you're not storing PII or you're not worried about a HIPAA compliance, maybe it's not necessary to take those extra steps. But you have to be aware, and you have to understand what the risk that you're taking on or the risk that you are offloading to something else.
Yeah, because as we were talking earlier, we talk about things like PCI, we talk about HIPAA, and then we talk about all the other data that doesn't fall necessarily under those, but is still considered sensitive to a lot of people. It always gets me. I mean, every time I see in the news where you see a breach and it talks about, it's the user's name and their mailing address, and I'm like, yeah, I used to get, name, mailing address, and phone number thrown on my doorstep every year. For everybody in town. And, now it's considered, oh, that's sensitive data. We can't, you can't have my address. You can't have my phone number. And it's interesting how we've kind of made those changes. And that, we have data breach laws. We have data breach notification laws that talk about, hey, here is what is personal data. And that differs where you go. At least here in the States, right? Every state's different. You go to different countries, it's different what's considered personal, what's not considered personal. And so, to your point of knowing what type of data you have, what are you dealing with, what are your regulations, and not necessarily stopping at regulations, but moving forward into, okay, you know what, we don't fall under HIPAA, but, we're trying to keep up with doing good security, so we're going to encrypt internally just because that's what we should be doing,
Yep. And you can say, people talk a lot about the democratization of data, bringing everybody's data to the masses and allowing us to make use of it. Well, I think there's the democratization of security as well, and now more people are aware of and need to be aware of, and everybody is given that choice of what do you consider sensitive, what does your country consider personally identifiable, and what are the steps that you can take. And then, to your last point, what is your moral obligation, or what is your what does your conscience say you have to do to be comfortable to sleep at night, knowing that you are taking on not just your companies, but potentially the data of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of strangers.
Right. And so, of course, what list wouldn't be appropriate without talking about updating, right?
Yep.
It's one of those things. We say it all the time. You know what I like, though, is we have so many systems now that do a better job of auto updating. A lot of, at least desktop systems, do a good job. You can turn on automatic updates to get the updates. But it is important, right? We got to make sure that not only are we keeping our operating systems updated, but also our server software updated, right?
Absolutely, and databases are certainly no exception to that. We at Couchbase have a whole kind of internal process to identify any vulnerability, to put a patch in place, and to release that out to our customers with a notification that says, hey, we've discovered or somebody else has discovered this. Here are the steps to avoid being caught out. Once you're aware of a vulnerability, it's really not just at Couchbase, but yours at every company. It's your obligation to take the steps to resolve that as quickly as possible, because you don't want to be in a position a day, a month, a year down the line where that vulnerability is exploited and someone comes back and says, did you know about this? It's one thing if you don't know, and certainly no one can be expected to protect themselves against all of the unknown unknowns. But once you're made aware of it, it's absolutely your obligation to put all that you can in place to resolve or mitigate that. And software updates are the first step towards that.
Yeah, and I feel like we're pretty good from an operating system level of getting notifications on updates. Microsoft, we know Tuesdays are coming out with patches. From databases, are we seeing the same thing? Where if I've subscribed to a database, doesn't matter which one, and I'm sure they're different, right? But I've got a database, I'm using it. How are we getting the updates to do you have to log into a panel to see that? Do you get email alerts? Because if we're responsible, obviously, for applying those patches, but how are we getting alerted that those patches are there?
Yeah. And the challenge, as you pointed out, is that everybody's a little bit different. There is not yet a standard, all databases will notify in this way, or all databases will notify to a central point that everybody can monitor. So you kind of have to understand the policies and the standards of the technology that you're working with. This is a big reason why people opt to purchase licenses for their otherwise open source databases. If you're running a database, if you're using something open source, it may be functioning very well for you, but it's the responsibility is on you to be much more involved and much more aware of the of the changes and the updates that are being put out there. So by purchasing a license or engaging with the vendor of that technology, you can still get all the benefits of open source, but you are taking that extra level to know that somebody else has got your back when it comes time to identifying and resolving security issues, and then pushing those notifications out to you. So for Couchbase, we do have an in-product notification. So if you happen to be logged in, you will get a notification there. We also have a forum and a email list that you can subscribe to that will we will proactively push out when something has been identified, and even so far as security-related notifications that aren't directly applicable to the product. So, for instance, just last week, Spectre and Meltdown aren't vulnerabilities that expose Couchbase as a technology, but affect our functioning on the underlying system. And so we wrote a blog and we sent a notice out to our customers telling them this is what Spectre and Meltdown mean to you in the context of Couchbase. There have been examples over the years of vulnerabilities that have affected Couchbase, vulnerabilities that looked like they might have but ended up not. So there's a whole range, and we try to do kind of the best we can to keep up to date with that, to notify our customers, and also to respond when someone asks us a question, says, hey, I saw this security vulnerability. It sounds like it might be related to you. What's your take on it? And be ready to have an answer.
Yeah, because I find that's pretty typical for a lot of places. You go out, you get something, and then you just kind of drop off. It's like, all right, I got it installed, I'm good. And then, 3 years later, somebody's like, you're, 6 revisions back on that, right? I mean, this thing is way outdated. And they're like, oh, were there updates to that? And, finding ways, and I think that's a complex problem to solve for a lot of vendors, right, is how do I get the key information to people so they'll actually get it? I get one person that installs it, and now they're gone. And so their email address that exists on the email list no longer is valid, so nobody's getting these emails, and it is a complex problem. It seems simple, but it actually becomes really difficult. It's we've got it on the the interface. So, but if you log into the interface, you'll see it. If you don't, you might not see it. And so,
sure.
Yeah, it becomes one of those things that updates are so important, yet we still have a hard time really getting out. And I think some people do better than others, but getting that word out. I think having the multiple mediums, the forums that people are logging into and staying on top of, and doing all of that is definitely putting that foot forward and saying, look, you want to use our stuff, here's how you got to kind of pay attention to us. We're going to do our best to reach out, but you still have a responsibility here. You have to keep doing this as well. And, like I said, I think some places do it way better than others, but it's important, and it's important for us as consumers of these type of applications or devices that, look, we have to stay on top of it. I talk a lot on this podcast about, doing things like application inventories and knowing, hey, what applications do you have? What dependencies do they have? How are you tracking all those dependencies? And this fits right in perfect to that type of thing of, hey, what do you got going on? And are you making sure you're applying the updates? We have to keep in mind, people they overlook this a lot, I think, that, updates can break things. As much as we love to say updates don't break anything, and they're only good, right? Updates can break things. Sometimes we have to put it into a test system first to make sure the update works properly. Maybe we did something outside the docs, and the update breaks our app, and we have to reconfigure something, and it's going to take longer to get there. So keeping in mind that, there may be more work than just saying, hey, we need to update. Fortunately, I think we're seeing a lot better for most of the software that it's not breaking stuff like that. But there's still that potential.
That's true. There is. And I think, we're all human to some degree. All of these systems are built by humans, and so you can only expect that everybody does their best. Everybody does what they believe to be acceptable, to be more than enough to do their best. And whether that's applying a security patch, or whether that's notifying about a security vulnerability, everybody is doing the best that they can.
Yeah, and I mean that's the point, right? Is you're sitting there showing that you're actually doing something. You're not just ignoring. Oh, I didn't know that patch was there 5 years ago. It's no, we knew it was there, and we're working on the updates. Because you get in that situation. You got breached. They say, hey, you were missing a patch from 3 months ago. Rather than say, yeah, we didn't patch it. It's human error. It's yeah, we saw that patch. It broke XYZ system. We're working on the updates so we can apply the patch, right? I mean, at least you're showing that kind of timeline of we're working to get this going. It didn't just drop in like we expected. And, from a security perspective, I think that goes a long way of being able to show, look, we're working on this process. Everything doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen, at the click of a button. Sometimes things take a little bit more work, and we got to work through those. And it's, as an organization, understanding what you're doing to walk through those processes. That's how you're really going to help kind of protect yourself and cover yourself in those type of events.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hear from our customers all the time that their auditors, their security auditors are not expecting everything to be perfect yesterday, and they're not expecting everything to be perfect tomorrow, but they just want a plan, and they want a roadmap to get to the point where you have addressed what you are aware of, and are looking forward to being able to take on anything new. And it really comes down to a partnership of working with internally within your company, and also with the vendors that you rely upon. It doesn't help anybody to point fingers to the developers. It doesn't help anybody to point fingers at the technology. We all have to work together to ensure that what we're doing supports you, and what you're doing supports us.
Yeah, that's a great point. And working to wrap this episode up, I think everything that we've talked about here, I mean, people have heard it, I think, most of it, and it's great to bring that reminder back up and dig a little bit more into it, and just put that back front of mind, is, look, here's what we need to be doing. And we say it, but, sometimes there's difficulties, there's roadblocks, we forget about certain things, and to be able to bring that back up and talk about it and explain why it's important is critical to help people understand this stuff. So, anything you want to leave the listeners with before we log off here?
I think it's just going back to kind of recap the two major things, I think, are education and awareness, making sure you know what data you're working with and where it is being exposed, and then working in conjunction with the vendors that are providing you that technology, and those two together, I think, are the recipe to success.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I appreciate you taking the time and coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, James, for having me, and thank you, listeners, for sticking with us.
And is there any way people can get a hold of you on social media, Twitter, or anything like that?
You can tweet at Couchbase. My name is Perry, Perry, at Couchbase.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on our forums. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Perfect. And I'm going to have in the show notes, I'll have a link out to Couchbase, and some other links, some information for people. If you've got any information you want shared in those show notes, just let me know. Send it over to me. And listen, everybody, databases, they're important. They're critical to what we do. We use them in everything that we do. So think about these different steps. I appreciate everybody listening. As always, if you've got questions, you want comments, you want to share any of your experiences, send them out to me at DevelopSec on Twitter, or hit me up at james@developsec.com. And for this episode, again, thanks to Perry for joining me, and we'll catch everybody on the next episode. Thanks a lot. See you later.
You have been listening to the DevelopSec podcast with James Jardine. To find out more about how we can help you with application security, follow us on Twitter at DevelopSec, or check out our website at www.developsec.com.